But yeah, okay. But it's only, but you only show it to other people. No, it's not something official because look, my head is not, I want, I look
And
like an
mine
idiot.
too. Look, I'm just, no, look,
I'm
I'm just in this place where like it's, yeah,
yeah.
it's just one room
No,
and not.
because we can, because yeah, because if you really need something more serious, I can also prepare a talk for, I don't know, 10, 15 minutes, and then you can record a small talk or a small, I don't know, 50 minutes explanation. Then you have something more serious than just
Mhm.
these random conversation.
Okay.
It's up to you,
Yeah, let's
but
try
we can.
both. We are recording this now, but we can also do 15 minutes next week.
Yeah, yeah.
Like when it will be like you tell me when. That's great. So, but it just let me explain you what we're doing. So the idea is we are taking interview not only with knowledgeable people like you, who spend a life trying to figure out how to, like professionally almost, how to live with other human beings without harming anybody, but with like different people. We took an interview from the UK policeman, who was describing how did they make decision in a police during the time when it was Labour in power, and how did it change when the Tories came to power. So we took an interview from farmers and from philosophers and from like really like we're trying to do it with like as many people as possible from the different background. But definitely with you, it's very it would be very interesting to talk about your political activism and your experience of specifically being in a group who try to withdraw themselves, to my understanding, from a normal capitalist patriarchal society and try to live a different lives. And probably that's affect the way how you relate to each other. Maybe not.
Yeah, it's more, it was, so my experience was more right from the beginning inside the radical left.
Mm,
So this decision, of course, so making politics in a different style and in a different kind, that's of course is for sure the starting point. But inside the radical left, there were different, so to say it easy, there were two poles. There's always, and I think this is true not only for Germany and not only for the last 3 or 4 decades, but it's maybe true for the radical communist anarchist left in total and in every country. I think it's so has to do with the essence of the politics that you have two poles. One is so more oriented about organization, party, and maybe overtaking the state for what purpose ever, and the other pole is more so self-organizing, autonomous, anti-hierarchical, so self-organization. And interestingly, it's not only that you have on the one pole, so party pole, state pole, you have all these communist and socialist tradition, and on the other pole, you have anarchist, radical leftists, libertarians, new social movements. But I think you have on both poles, you have both poles as well, so to speak. So you have in these communist party pole, you have these two poles, and you have in this anarchist tradition, you have these two poles. So anarchists more oriented in a broader organizing, so the syndicalist tradition, and these more so autonomous street punks squatting tradition. And on the communist pole, you have as well, you have these very so well-known, officially orthodox Leninist party pole, Trotskyist, Maoist, Stalinist, etc.
I'm so sorry. So
You have not, so you have on the anarchist pole, you have these two poles, so more organization, syndicalist tradition on the one hand, and on the other hand, so more so street punk, so street anarchism, squatting houses pole. And you have on this communist side, you have these more party-oriented politics, like it's so these official traditions, so from Trotsky, Lenin, Maoist, Stalinist parties, and you have this libertarian communist tradition, which is so more anti-Leninist. And this was these two poles that they were also inside these so-called new left in Germany after 68. So 68 was so more these in Germany it was much more so a student movement. And it was right from the beginning. I think this was maybe the slogan to frame the whole movement. It was an anti-authoritarian revolt in the beginning. But so, and in the beginning it was more like so these movement pole. So it was also called student movement. So it was so like you think a movement is organized. But when the movement already around 69 in the beginning of the 70s came in the situation of exhaustion, already begun so the kind of it's called the Leninization of the German of the student movement. So all this red decade of the 70s in Germany were dominated not by so these movement pole, but more by these other pole, these so that the movement, the student movement became so more party oriented and organized. Were organized in a lot of different so communist party. The whole area or the whole decade is called the era of the K groups in Germany. So K is for communist groups. So this was all it was so a little bit like so the first episode of the communist party politics ended in the tragedy of Stalinism. So this time it ended up in this more so farce. It was more a farce because these communist parties were not run by proletarian or working class people, but by students, and they all aimed to be so or become to be a much more broader mass party. And in fact they were not that small, but it was mostly students being organized.
Oh, but if I was sorry, I didn't know anything about that. So they were informal parties, or they like were formally registered bureaucratic institutions?
There were not really mass parties who go to election. It was not these so parliament oriented party politics, but it were so in the area of the student movement. It was mostly students, but also workers or also younger people who did a so-called Ausbildung, so a qualification period of 1 or 2 years. And it was more in focus, not going to elections, getting voted, going to the parliament, becoming, I don't know, government. It was so more outside these lines. But nevertheless, it was really close organized with membership, with something like so really so official meetings, and also with so a little bit like so functionaries, and so members are paying money, and you have so these official meetings where you discuss so the political line and all these kind of politics. So this was quite dominant in the 70s, and also it was in a way it became quite orthodox. So there were different K groups, different communist groups. Hi there.
Hello.
So there were different. I'm explaining a little bit the situation in Germany in the 70s, and while during 68 in Germany there was so this so-called student movement, which was more so spontaneous, movement-oriented kind of politics, and which in the 70s already became so more orthodox and even a little bit dogmatic in the area of the so-called K groups, so smaller communist groups. Still inside the universities and the student movement, but more oriented in so making really serious party politics. And this was the case till the end.
Okay, so wait, so I have a question.
Yeah.
So what does it mean, party politics? So they didn't go to parliament, they were still sitting at university. Do you mean the way how they make decisions? Yeah, so they would just have like leaders and a formal structure with meetings and what?
It was like an organization, like a Trotskyist organization, like you have these Trotskyist groups inside the university. This is how these politics work. So they were not interested in going to election. They were far too small to become a mass party like Social Democrats or later in the 80s, the Green Party. But they had quite a few members, some couple of thousands each. Then they were quite influential inside these mostly students area, not working class, not fabrics, not the real proletariat, but inside intellectuals and inside so the bigger cities and in the area of universities. and they were quite capable to organize and mobilize people. So they make also bigger demonstrations and some kind of campaigns. They were the first one who starting to make bigger demonstration against atomic energy, against fascist meetings of the NPD, of the Nationaldemokratische Partei Deutschland. So they were the leading groups for all kind of radical leftist politics in the 70s in Germany. So after
How did they connect it to this urban guerrilla and really radical militant groups? Have they sympathizers, or did they have a formal any connection? So it's not unknown.
So there were in the student movements, there were the so-called Spontis. Spontis means just spontaneous people, because the student movement around 68, which lasted only for a very short period, so 67, 68, 69, and then this kind of student movement, there were different strains coming out. One strain, the dominant strain in the 70s, when the student movement went into exhaustion and in decline, one reaction was to get stronger and better organized in these car groups. But there were still these more spontaneous groups, or like subcultures. So these hippies, they became these kind of hippie people, then squatting people. Also in Germany, they were not that big, but these city Indians, they were called Stadtindianer. Also in Italy, they were quite influential. So there were also these kind of which become more something like making politics more in the style of a subculture. But they were not that dominant in at least not on the political level. They have a quite big impact on the cultural level, and in general all the sexual liberation, for example, it started around the student movement. But you have to imagine the student movement, students, it was the beginning of the mass universities. So a lot of younger people went to university, but it was still much less than today, where half of the younger people are going to study. And inside this whole population who were at universities, only, I don't know, 5 or 10% were really radical leftist students. So it was a very small movement after all. The 68 was much smaller than the situation in the US with the civil rights movement and Berkeley. It was much smaller than May 68 in Paris, and it was also much smaller than the situation in Italy, where you had not only something like a student movement, but also still a very big new radical proletarian movement, which later became autonomia operaia and all these operist and post-operist kind of politics. So in Germany, it was only, I don't know, like a few percent of the whole population, but it shows that it was just a social necessity, that there were some kind of turning point in the 60s. And in Germany, it was more than this historical moment, or this historical turning point needed some subject to make this kind of breakthrough. And in Germany, it was the student movement, all these anti-authoritarian politics, all these sexual liberation. I think that was it was on the agenda anyway. But it was enough to have a few thousand students to proclaim this kind of change, to liberalize the whole society. Everybody was part of the sexual liberation. Also, nearly every woman was part of this new second wave of feminism. But it's interesting that it's enough to have some radical students to name a whole episode after these kind of 5% of the population, or even 5% inside the student and university population.
So, but you're saying they were like running their structures in a Leninist authoritarian way, kind of, because if I understood correctly what you said, it was a reaction on spontaneous students movements before, and they try to kind of catch up the fallen apart energy by
Yeah.
structuring it. Yeah. And so that's why they were not a party, but they were like literally trying to be very, very kind of even bureaucratically organized, not
It's the same situation like you always have. There's first a movement, the movement has its point, but it's very only for is really a certain very short sequence or for a historical moment. Like you had it in Greece after the murder of the young guy, and then these kind of so really heavily riot situation, mass mobilization, and then when it started to become so exhausted, then this kind of Syriza organization began. You have the same situation in Spain with these Indignadas and Podemos. You have it a little bit so like with the Zapatistas, which also become not really institutionalized, but so you always have a kind of starting point, which is more a momentum, a movement, and then you have the situation where people start to say, okay, what to do with this accumulation of political activism? We have to do something, we have to find of organizing it or even institutionalizing it before it's gone. And so
but the way how do they institutionalize it looks like different. For example, Zapatistas are sticking to this tradition, like Native American tradition looks like. They don't have a representative democracy. They obviously not a Stalinist Marxist party, and their type of bureaucracy that is actually exist, and the people complaining that it took forever to make any decisions to move forward with them because they're so slow. But it's an institution to be slow, and this whole institution, to my understanding, build around uh, the idea that everybody should be part of making decision process, and they have a ground for that. And so these German students in 60s that you just described, they had a different ideas, like compared to Zapatistas, let's say.
no, I wouldn't say it's said, okay, it's 2 decades or 3 decades earlier, but I think in general it's you can really compare it. And I don't mean that the 70s was this decade of the so-called car groups, so more dogmatic or orthodox or communist groups. I don't mean it only in a negative way. I also think so Syriza is not only a bad experience, and even if it's something bad, it has to do with the quandaries and the dilemma of politics in general, that you always have these two poles. You have the so movement, riot, demonstration pole on the one hand, self-organizing, and then you have on the other hand that out of this kind of experience, the same people often start to make so more institutionalized, not so in a neutral sense, or you can also say more organized or more coherent or serious. I don't know. It always sounds like something bad, but I don't think so. Zapatistas is one way of so using this kind of energy, activism, mobilization, and finding something so which can continue and reproduce itself. The student movement found these in these so more party oriented, of course not traditional party politics like communist parties in the 20s, but so more so getting so stronger organized in really groups with memberships, official meetings with an office, with some kind of program, etc. And
Yeah.
so the same also with Syriza, the same people who went on the street on these mass strikes and the mobilization when they felt that so it's useless or the momentum is gone or people are exhausted and this mobilization is not going any further, then they started to say, okay, we have to organize. Podemos is a little bit the same. Or in Italy, you had the same. Also, the German Green Party, in a way, is also an outcome of these alternative milieu, which was popped up in the end of the 70s. So already one decade after these car groups, where you have in the 80s in Germany, again, these two poles. You have on the one hand the new Green Party, which in the beginning was absolutely not the same Green Party as you know it today, although so from retrospectively you can see a lot of So
Out boys, who helped to organize Joseph Boys, who helped to organize Green Party. They kicked him out immediately. Yeah.
Yeah, but also he's also an ambivalent figure. You see in Boys, you see the ambivalence in the Green Party, because he was not only a progressive guy. He had also a flank which was open to, I think, so esoteric, new right wing ideas. So, and the Green Party in the beginning was more a melting pot from different people coming from the car groups, so people from this former student movement. Then you had a new young generation of the 80s. Then you had these more ecological interested people. Then you had people from different so-called Teilbereichskämpfe, from different kind of struggles, peace movement, anti-nuclear energy movement. Also, so younger people coming from subcultures and started to think, so okay, now I want to make a little bit more serious politics, not only being a punker, but also getting more engaged and stuff. So in the beginning, the Green Party was a little bit like Podemos, or was a little bit like Syriza in the beginning. And then step by step, if you start the party way, these traditional party parliamentary way, it's impossible that you don't end up how Syriza ended up, or how the Green Party ended up, or how every at the beginning maybe interesting, totally different, totally alternative party will start. You always end up with first saying, okay, if we are a party, we can't only be always in the opposition, we also have to take responsibility, but let's make it only on the local level, only in our city, only in Berlin. And then you always have to start in a coalition, because if you're a new party, if you're a leftist party, then you have to go in coalition with social democrats, and then all these compromises begin. And now you have a Green Party which is totally only interested in taking over power, only showing that they can do better than the conservatives or the liberals. It was the same with the social democrats. The social democrats never wanted to overcome the state. They always wanted to show that they can run the state better, that they can run the military better, that they can go better to war, that they can better exploit people, or in a more human way. It's already I think it's totally, these kind of experiences totally exhausted. And I don't blame Syriza for what they ended up or what they had to do under these circumstances. I think it's just that and I think also Bernie Sanders or Corbyn, it would be exactly the same experience, not because the day after the election of Corbyn starts to become an idiot, or he only is interested in making compromises. It's just that politics in a bourgeois society, in a capitalist society, can totally be different from this experience we had, which does not mean that it does not make a difference to have. Of course, it makes a big difference.
I think about Corbyn, yeah, first of all, they didn't let him in, as well as Sanders. Yeah, so that was not possible in the beginning, because the system are constructed in very smart and complicated ways. So these guys like Corbyn and Sanders didn't have any chance. But then when we took an interview about decision making from the police, London police person, yeah, so that's so strikingly different how not the whole country, but just the police was run during Labour and during Tories. So many people would die. And the same things about virus. It's just such a big difference. Even if they steal the stupid party and so on and so forth, for the people who live in this territory, it's make the whole world different.
It make a big difference. It's only, I think you have to turn it around. It makes a difference. What is wrong to think to burden these kind of projects with expectations they can never fulfill. Also, all this decolonization process, of course, it makes a big difference being a colonized country or not being a colonized country. But it was wrong to project all these hopes of our metropolitan situation to these fighting people I don't know, wherever, be it in Vietnam, in Mozambique, in Angola, or whatever. It's impossible that they can not only overcome the colonized situation, but also create a totally, I don't know, green, ecological, feminist, so country inside a still totally globalized capital world with all these kind of
Yeah, because they were not allowed to, because France is still controlling, you know, for example, France is still controlling X, you know, and that's why they were not able to, like, you know, Kenya, France is selling the Kenyan forest for some reason, you know. So how can they be nice if somebody else controlling their money, like the natural resource, running their businesses, and called that they're not colonies, but that's simply true. It's lies.
But I think the problem goes deeper. It's not only that they don't have the total control, but even if a country has total control, nobody really knows how to organize these kind of capitalist machinery. So how to make a totally new kinds of politics, which is neither the state apparatus nor these totally spontaneous assembly, everybody comes together. You can't run even a city like Paris or London by only making a full assembly and discuss what do you want to produce here, what do you want to drive the buses and etc. Nobody, and this is why political economy is so closely connected. It's impossible to find, to really know how to make a communist or socialist, or however you want to call it, society. No class knows it, no university.
But
No.
Frank, like actually, that's 30 years of Zapatistas is showing that it's possible. And yesterday in this Museum of Care Assembly, we had the guests from Barcelona and Amsterdam, who is running this forum for the reimagining the city, and all of this, you know, Murray Bookchin and David Bookchin was there. So it looks like this democratic municipalism, which has a different name, but that's one that I remember. Yeah, so that looks like it's working. So they just, if I understand correctly, their agenda. So what do they do? And they just taking all decisions locally, but then they create dual power. It's the same things like Rojava. They're not claiming, they don't want to become a state themselves. Yeah. So, but they just want to, and also Rojava is 3 million people living for 8 years now without state, and
under the hardest conditions you can imagine.
Exactly. And so they really like showing, no, it's actually possible. And you don't need to call it communism because they don't have a communist government, but every municipality or every local group of people make their own decisions, and then they can connect with each other. So basically there's 30 years of experience of Zapatistas and 8 years of experience in Rojava, and also a bunch of theories is now looks like people trying to implement the same in Europe. They are connecting it to the cities and stuff. Exactly in the cities.
I think the good experience we have in history, unfortunately, they are always niches. They are locally niche and they are temporally niche. So also the Spanish situation in the middle of the 30s, the Paris Commune, the very short experience we had in Germany with all these Räte republics. They were always very short. I don't say it doesn't work, but I think so the problem is you have it only mostly on a local level, and you always had it on a in a short historical sequence, mostly because of the general conditions, not because they were too stupid and it was a kind of implosion like you have it with the Soviet Union and all these real socialist countries, but because these all the extremely foreign neighborhood you had. It was impossible in the 20s in Germany to really establish a Räterepublik, a Soviet republic like they tried in Munich and in other regions, because the reactionary forces were so incredibly strong. The same goes for the Paris Commune. And so you have these few exceptions which are still only niches under very so particular conditions like Zapatistas or like Rojava, where maybe.
But why is it it's exclusion? It's maybe an exclusion that's proof the rule. Because from what you're saying, I'm gather that the problem is not that Paris Commune were not able to run the city. Actually, they did. They introduced 8 hours a day. They introduced so many things that we are now considered to be normal in every city, like street lights and so on and so forth. Yeah, but they, as you correctly said, they were crushed by outside forces. So Zapatistas and Rojava actually develop a strategy how to deal with these outside sources, like how to deal with Mexican government, how to deal with ISIS, and so on. So if to my understanding, the rule is create this dual power situation, and then move all the decisions locally and develop certain relationship with the outside power without trying to take it over. So Paris Commune, for example, chose deliberately not to get the money from the bank, and they were not actually building any hostile protection. They were somehow hoping that, to my knowledge, that it will be fine. And they also decided not to connect to the other cities who in France in that time, like Marseille, who wanted to create a commune themselves. So that's why they were like crushed. That was a mistake, not that they didn't build the party or they were not able to.
But why has it never worked on the level of a whole nation? Why Venezuela is such a disaster? Why all these experience with South America were such a disaster? Why all these real socialist states were such a disaster?
Because they were states and they operated on the idea of national state, and that's the mistake, to my understanding.
Yeah, absolutely true. But this was already the lesson they learned of the Paris Commune. One lesson of all these disasters they had in 1848 and of the Paris Commune from Leninists and others, where we can never maintain our power and our situation if we are in a condition like in the Paris Commune, where we don't have the state, don't have the weapons to
protect us. So Zapatistas are protecting themselves very differently than Lenin, and that's allowed them to basically not to become the Stalinist nightmare. So they use the different means. For example, they use media that didn't exist during the Paris Commune time, but did exist now. So the Mexican state can crush them easily, but they don't do that because that will be a political disaster for them.
Because it's a niche, but also because it's a niche. They don't aim to control all over Mexico. They don't say now we march to Mexico City like on a long Maoist march. If they would do that, it would be immediately over. So they have their niche, like you in Hamburg or in Berlin. You can have a niche when you squat a house, when you defend it, when you make good media politics. Maybe the city says, okay, we give you this building, you can make there your party, you can make there your assemblies and your political meetings. And then you have a niche for maybe for a long time period inside, so a foreign or hostile or even friendly neighborhood. There are these 6 experiences. It was also the idea in the 80s of this autonomous movement in Germany to create these autonomous spaces, free spaces. Also in Italy, you had this with these zone also called autonomous zone. Zapatistas is, and it's a good example, but it's not a squatted area in a big city, but it's a whole particular region where it's really based and rooted in the people who are living there.
Yes, but so why is it bad strategy to, or what is the problem with the strategy just created slowly half a world of that autonomous zone and link them? Because whenever you link them, they become stronger. Zapatistas were able to survive because they were backed very heavily, exactly by these guys like Germany, like autonomous Italians, and so on and so forth. Actually, we can see that it's all working together, you know. And it's the same things like Rojava is not so much actually backed up, but hopefully they will. But it looks like we're trying to figure out all together how to make not take over state, but make the whole world be a bunch of niches that's connected to the network.
Yeah, that was the idea of this autonomous movement in the 80s in Germany. It was so based on squatted houses, on autonomous spaces, on people living and also collectively working together, and especially in the so-called youth center, in this autonomous youth center, which exists in every bigger city. And there were these connections between cities and this idea of not being inside a party organization or a party-like organization, but connected on a non-hierarchical level amongst people who think so, have the same ideas in general. So this was also the idea in the 80s of this autonomous movement, and it quite worked, but it only worked for again for only a decade. So like the Communist Party groups in the 70s coming out of the student movement of 68 only lasted for a decade. Also the autonomous scene or the autonomous movement only lasted for a decade before, for different reasons, it in a way was exhausted. Half it broke down, half it transformed, and half it was just overtaken because so it wasn't a threat anymore. These kind of, so for example, being a punk in these days, if you colored your hair and you had I don't know, if you have tattoos, you were really an outlaw. Now everybody it's totally normal. It's a patchwork of minorities and all these neoliberal taking over of all kinds of subcultures. So it was just useless to make these kind of politics, which were incredibly effective. And in a way, it was a success. It ended not because it was a total disaster or it doesn't work anymore, but it was too much of a success in a way.
Yeah, but so you're describing the situation when it's evolved. It's not, yeah, it was born and then it's become something else and so on and so forth. So then I will just ask you this question, and because we have today preparation for the real 15 minutes interview.
Yeah. Okay.
So what I would like to really know that I don't understand, what is the difference of making a decision like in the day-to-day level in these different communities? Because everybody is, you know, so we all love Zapatistas, but we talk to the different people. In, for example, I more and more understand that it's impossible to take practices of some people, different traditions, different languages, living in different lives, and then plant them in a situation where we are now. So, and I still, I'm puzzled how to build a community and how to correctly make decisions. But I do know that you was very successful in a way that you're still part of this movement, and you was part of this movement for, I don't know how long, for 30 years. So that somehow you know the secret.
I think the success lies in these kind of always every decade has to transform in itself and reinvent itself, and it was always these two poles which dominated. So 68 was the movement pole, the 70s was these more so party oriented or closer organization pole. Then again in the 80s you had this autonomous movement, which in the end of the 80s started to become much more again better organized like in the 70s, but not as communist parties but as Antifa groups. So all these Antifa groups were a little bit like small, not really parties, but I don't know, between 50 and 30 people in a city. Everybody knew everybody. You knew you are in the same group. The group had a certain name. The group was responsible for the actions they are doing. And all these groups in a way went out of these kind of more lifestyle autonomous subculture movement where decisions were mostly made by assemblies. And this was very, very exhausting, especially for my generation, being quite young at this time. I saw that it really does not work very well. If we are honest, there's nothing worse than a full assembly in a university where everybody can talk. People with absolutely no experience have the same influence, or the people who are much more so proud of them, of their own knowledge, they take over. Mostly men who think they have already quite experience, and so people more shy or not able to speak in public. So all these problems we know about, so already of this level of full assembly, not to speak about these. So you always have to, then you need people who are really responsible to make what the assembly have decided. Then you need some kinds of representatives, and you need to kind of mandate people. Then you have to negotiate with other cities, other full assemblies, etc. And this is such exhausting, and it's okay for a moment, and it can be really a totally brilliant experience, but it's always a temporary and very short. I'm sure you all had these kind of, I don't know, Zakoti Park or Genoa G8, or it can be very powerful, and it's very important to politicize people and to go in public, but to really organize 10 years, 15 years, I don't know, a political group or a campaign or something like anti-racist struggle, feminism, you need some kind of more than only the full assembly or the plenar situation.
Wait,
You
I
need
want to
really good
ask
work.
you something. Sorry. So,
Yep.
am I right that we're talking about different type of decision and process? One is if you have to organize, for example, an Antifa campaign or some kind of anti-racist struggle, then it's almost like a military operation. You know, you have an enemy, or you're acting against something, and then you have to live in a mobilize mode. And if you do these assemblies, you would go nowhere. But if you're, for example, trying to make decision how to live in a village, you know, how to share resources of water, or, you know, things like that, then so this fixed group of people who's living in this village, they have water, they have to share that, you know, as much time as it takes to decide who is having the water, then they have to spend this time. That's what Zapatistas doing. The students groups or the museum assembly meetings as well. We don't have a common water. We're not a family. We're not villages. We don't live in the same house. And that's why, you know, our assemblies, when we tried to make a decision about website, was a disaster because, you know, nobody did a website actually, but everybody has an opinion how somebody else should do that, you know, and so on. But for example, if we will do some practical project, where we or whoever would be collected in the same physical space, then we should figure out how to make decisions. And probably then we will use the techniques that you guys use in Antifa, and not the one that didn't work in the student movement. So if I'm understood you correctly, you're saying that the two different type of practices how to make decisions, and they never work if they apply to the wrong circumstances. So if you want to make concrete decisions, you have to have a very concrete problem. And if you want to make a decision about some kind of, like, you know, world situation, and you're trying to do it in an assembly, then, you know, it's you spend sometimes nicely, but then it's, of course, will evaporate.
Of course, it's still, it's quite easy to find a technique to find or to come to decisions if you are 20 people meeting 2 times a week, know each other for a long time. It's a totally different thing to run a city, not to speak about a whole country. If you think of how to organize a city or a whole country, or even a region where the Zapatistas are active, you always in the end come to forms like we have it in the representative democracy. you always come to you need some kind of specialization. You need people who are responsible for something. You need something like a law. You need something like
Wait. Zapatistas doesn't have that. Now I'm losing you. Actually, Zapatistas doesn't have that. Rojava doesn't have that. So they have this local groups who spend lots of time in the assembly deciding about their local projects. And everybody who is in this local group, who know each other, 20 people or like 200 people, they deciding about it. But then they have a network. And it's not a representative democracy. For example, Zapatistas, as you know, they have a delegates who cannot make any decisions. They can go to the government, for example, or to the other delegates, consult them, and come back to the original group and consult. So that's take longer, but I imagine you can run city like that. I think you can. So some group is actually in Germany, you know that there's all these buildings that was squads before, and then they become cooperative. They are running fine, yeah, and they're running by assembly. How do you call it in German? Do you know what I'm talking about? This buildings that belongs to the people who live there. They not belong to the investors.
house projects.
Yeah, that's a
That's it.
great model.
Yeah, but it's the same. You still have to go to work. You still have to go to clinics when you are ill. You still have to go to the police when someone is stealing your
Yes.
car. You still have.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
just
But
a different kind of,
I'm not
instead of
saying it's
paying rent
solving
to
all
a
the
landlord,
problems.
pay
Yes,
the credit for the bank.
yeah, it's
It's a
not
good
solve
idea,
all
but
the
it's not an.
problems, but it solves the problems. One big problem in the city, housing problem. They are running their houses differently than anybody else in the city. So, and this problem solved and it's working. So, you can imagine that the police could be solved differently. It's just nobody started to do that. And the same things about clinics. And I know that in Greece they do experiment with this different way of arranging healthcare. Yeah. So, for example, they do have that practices, and maybe we can just combine all these different practices, and that's how we build the city, like the new cities.
Yeah, I think often it's born because out of a bad situation, like in Greece, where they had to make these kind of self-organize of an organizing, and it's often it's coming out of a bad situation, and it's just doing the same in a little bit alternative way, more self-exploitation, more by being totally political convinced that it's necessary than to make it only because you need some income. And I think so. I think what we are really need is to overcome, in a way. Of course there are alternatives, and of course you can reform the police, you can make the clinics more self-organized clinics, less under pressure of the big, I don't know, companies. But so what we really need is a society that much different that you can even imagine it, like the, I don't know, people in the Middle Age, which were totally religious people living in feudalism, couldn't imagine how a society would work where you have the right to have rights, where so there's no god, where it's a totally illumination, where the production is based on natural science and all these kind of stuff. So of course, I'm always interested, or I'm always engaged in all these kind of experiments and finding alternatives. So, but I think so the big thing is how to overcome so these kind of, even have to do these kind of politics. And so I think the problem is, even if we are a group of 20 people, we have the same problems like you have when you have a very big society or the whole state. This is why out of these communist party politics came out only a new state, because these parties were the kernel of the new state. They always had these, so what to do if people don't follow the party line, what to do if people stealing from the party's money, what to do if feminists are saying, this guy is a sexual harasser and stuff. You have the same mechanisms and the same necessities, and it's because you are doing politics, or you have to do economics if you try to organize, I don't know, a different kind of a living in a house community, etc. but how to imagine a society out of the necessities of, on the one hand, politics, and on the other hand, economy, which of course are entangled. We have to overcome political economy as such. And so in a way, I remember when we talked about, when you talked about these possibilities of digitization and open democracy, so this, although we see it doesn't work like we hoped for it, but this was something like a third, like a totally new technology, where at least in the beginning there was a hope that you can make decisions where everybody can participate, but not having these stupid full assembly situation where everybody has to gather every day, coming to a certain place, debating for hours and hours. So maybe, so thinking in this direction of really a totally different kind of doing politics or anti-politics, making decisions in a way that's not even has not even the character of a decision anymore.
Yeah, I love the idea of post-politics. No, not politics. No, yeah, politics. Political economy. Yeah. That's all
different. It's the same with gender. It's the same. Why was gender feminism such a new thing?
David was saying that politics, police, and the police all have the same roots. So, yeah. So his proposal was to stop this and to replace it with freedom and care. So that was his proposal.